So, what is an organic molecule? Well, organic here is going to refer to life. So, we're talking about those molecules that are life dependent or life is built up of, things of that nature. And for us, the big thing here is remember that we are a carbon based life form. In fact, most of our life on the planet is based on carbon. So, for an organic molecule to be considered organic, it has to have carbon in it. Now, that carbon can do several different things. We can have straight chains, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We also can have some branch chains, and then also carbon can form a ring by itself. One of the things to remember about carbon is that it has four bonding sites. So every time you see it, you're going to find out that it'll have four different things attached to it, or it'll have four bonds. Now, the key to most of our organic molecules are going to be these functional groups that we'll talk about, and you'll hear them mentioned quite a bit. This one you should remember from our acids and bases talk earlier in the term. We talked about the hydroxyl group, which is an oxygen and a hydrogen, but we have some others as well. We have a carbonyl group, which is going to be an end chain carbon double bonded to oxygen, or it can be inside of a chain. It's an oxygen double bonded to a carbon. We also have the amino group, which will become important when we talk about amino acids, and then we have our carboxyl group as well, which here is our double bonded oxygen like a carbonyl plus our hydroxyl, and that's how we got our carboxyl group there. Okay, a term you're going to hear a lot of is macromolecules. These quite simply are our big molecules, okay? And they're big for both reasons. Big in size, but also big in importance. There's four primary ones that we want to be concerned of. Most of them are going to come in the form of a polymer or something of a long molecule that's going to be made up of smaller things called monomers. And you can see here how they're all kind of linked together here. So when we're talking about the really big macromolecules, that's kind of what we're looking at there. Now, our four types are our proteins, and our proteins are built up of the amino acids, and this is what gives us our support, our function. They also work as enzymes. They're very important. That's what we're made up of, is proteins. The next one are carbohydrates. We have three different kinds of those. We have monosaccharides, which are one sugars, disaccharides two, and then poly, which is many sugars together, and this is where we get our energy from. The third is the lipids, and these are our fats and oils. They're made of a glycerol and some fatty acids, and this is how we have long-term storage for energy. Okay, and then finally we have our nucleic acids, and those are made up of nucleotides, and that's where we store our hereditary information, so our DNA and our RNA to a certain extent. And we'll be spending a lot of time covering those four macromolecules for the rest of this unit and throughout the rest of the class. Okay, our final slide today is on dehydration, synthesis, and hydrolysis. And this one here is going to talk about how we make these big macromolecules. The first one we'll talk about is dehydration, synthesis. Synthesis means to make, so we're going to be making something, and we're going to do it by dehydrating it. If you think about us, when we talk about dehydration, we're talking about losing water, not getting enough water. And that's exactly what we're going to see down here in dehydration synthesis. If we take two molecules of sugar, we'll notice that we're going to take a hydrogen off of a hydroxyl group here and our actual hydroxyl group off of the carbon over here. And by removing, dehydrating this water out, what we're ended up with is a macromolecule here where both of the sugars are bonded to that leftover oxygen. Now, the opposite of this is hydrolysis. Hydrolysis is going to use water to break it apart. So here we're adding our water to our large macromolecule, and it's going to come in here where it's bonded to this oxygen. And one of the hydrogens is going to bond with that oxygen and form a hydroxyl group. And the other hydroxyl group will bond to the carbon on this side, and we can see that happening right over here. And that takes our one big molecule and splits it up into the two littler ones. Okay, so that's it for this video. Good luck with the lessons, and as always, we'll see you next video. Okay, so let's talk about carbohydrates real quickly. We're going to talk about the various types of carbohydrates. There's three primary ones. They are the monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. The monosaccharides, mono means one, so these are going to be the simple sugars, one sugar alone, and our examples are going to be fructose here and glucose there. If I take a fructose and a glucose and I add them together, like we see over here, we get sucrose, and that's going to be a disaccharide. A di means two, so these are going to be two monosaccharides joined together. We looked at sucrose over here. We have lactose, which is a milk sugar, and then also maltose, which is when we get two glucoses that are bonded together. Now, what if we add more of those together? Then we get what we call a polysaccharide, and that's going to be many of these monosaccharides joined together. There are three kinds I want you to be familiar with. Plants store energy as starch, so things like potatoes and corn and things of that nature are going to have an awful lot of these sugars attached to each other, and that's what the starch is. We also have cellulose, which we'll talk about when we talk about the cells, and that's what forms the cell wall in plants. And then finally, as animals, we store it as glycogen, so long strings of sugar attached together. Remember, sugars are what provides us with our energy, so we want to be able to break up the monosaccharides, the easy ones, but we want to be able to store them as a whole bunch together. Okay, let's talk about carbohydrates and health real quickly. Remember, carbohydrates or the sugars are the main source of energy for our cells, and we'll learn about that when we talk about cellular respiration. We want to remind you that there are simple sugars and complex sugars. Simple sugars are going to be your monosaccharide and disaccharides. That'll be one or two. Most of the disaccharides and things of that nature are going to be these processed sugars, and we'll talk about that in a couple seconds. We also have complex carbohydrates, and those are going to be the polysaccharides, and those we tend to get from our vegetables and whole grains, things of that nature. And we're looking for a starch and fiber. Now, starch we can break apart and we can get energy from it. Fiber we can't digest. We don't break that apart, but it's necessary to help us with the digestive process, so we do want to get our fiber in our diet as well. Now, you've heard about good and bad carbs. These processed sugars tend to line up in the bad carbs here, and what you'll notice is normally when we eat, so here's our eating time, we'll see a spike in our blood sugar, and that spike in the blood sugar releases insulin out at the same time we're eating, and then that insulin is able to control it and we stay about where we should be. Now the bad sugars, notice the spike is going to be a little bit higher here, so we get a little more energy out there, and then the insulin returns to normal, but notice where the blood sugar goes. The blood sugar comes all the way down into here, and this is what we know is a sugar crash or something of that nature, not very healthy for us. If we don't have enough energy, and that energy is that sugar, so if we don't have enough sugar, we don't have enough energy for the life processes to continue, and that's not a good thing. Okay, well that ends this video. Good luck in the lessons, and as always, we'll see you in the next video. Okay, so why are lipids important? Well, first of all, they carry and transport vitamins and get them into the body for us, and that's important for us to get them. Also, there's the essential fatty acids, and those are necessary to build things out of these lipid structures, such as the cell membrane, and we'll take a look at that in a little bit. And then the other thing we want to remember about lipids is they allow us to store energy. So if we have too much energy in the cell, then it stores it as a lipid or a fat, and that's how we accumulate or keep energy for later on. So it's kind of like our reserves. Okay, so there are three main types of lipids. They are the triglycerides, the phospholipids, and the steroids. The triglycerides, tri is 3, so that's going to be one molecule of glycerol and 3 fatty acids. That's where the tri comes from. And this is our source of stored energy. So this is how we store excess energy in the body, or an organism store the excess energy for use later on. We also have our phospholipids. Our phospholipids have the one molecule of glycerol as well, and only 2 fatty acid molecules. They also have a phosphorus. That's why this phospho is here. And this is what forms the lipid bilayer that we find in cell membranes, and we'll take a look at that in the next slide. And then our third main type of lipid are the steroids. And the steroids are made of 4 attached carbon rings, and this is found in our hormones, cholesterol, and in vitamin D. Okay, so let's take a real quick look at the cell membrane, and you can see that we have the inside of the cell here and the outside of the cell here, and this is our cell membrane, and basically what it does is it separates the inside from the outside of the cell. Now, the bulk of the cell membrane is right here. It's made up of these phospholipids, and you can see it right here, okay, and we have 2 different parts. We have the fatty acid tails here, the 2 tails here, and these make it hydrophobic. So that means it doesn't bond with water. And you know, if you put oil in water, it separates, and that's what happens here. You have this layer here that does not allow water through it, and that's what allows you to keep water inside the cell. Now, the other part of this is the hydrophilic end here, which is water liking, water loving, and then water can come right up to there. You'll also notice that we also have several different protein channels and things that we'll talk about a little bit later when we get into our talking about the cell membrane. but I wanted to show you that it's made of this lipid bilayer. So we have the water loving on both sides, and then this water phobic, doesn't like the water here, and this is what creates the barrier between the cell and its outside environment. Okay, so that's it for this video. Good luck with the lessons, and as always, we'll see you in the next video. Okay, let's begin by talking a little bit about proteins and then eventually amino acids. Proteins are our most complicated molecules in living things. It's what we're made up of, and there are a bunch of different proteins that are necessary to manufacture an organism like ourselves, and each of those proteins is going to be a complex structure. Now, proteins are going to be made up of amino acids, and there are 20 different amino acids found in proteins. So if you think of it like letters in our alphabet, we can take the letters of our alphabet, put them together in a bunch of different combinations, and that's how we can make words, and put those words together is how we can make stories. So you can see that there's an awful lot of proteins that we can make out of these 20 different amino acids. Now, a protein is going to be a polymer, which means it's going to be a series of repeating units. Those repeating units are the monomers, and those are going to be our amino acids. So if we look at an amino acid, we can kind of see what it's all about. We have a central carbon. It's an organic molecule, so it has to have the carbon in it. It has this amino group here on one end, okay, and that's a nitrogen and 2 hydrogens. And then on the other end, we have this carboxyl group, which is a double bonded oxygen and our OH radical down here. Then this part here, this R group, this is what separates the amino acids. So this here is what determines which amino acid it is. Okay, so that's our amino acids, and when we string them all together, we make our proteins. Now, how do we form these together? We call it, when we string these amino acids together, a peptide bond. So that's what we're going to look at. And in our example here, we have 2 amino acids. We have alanine and serine, and we're going to link them together and form a peptide bond. Now, if you remember back, we talked about something called dehydration synthesis. And look here, we're taking out a water molecule and we're joining these 2 together. So we're going through a dehydration synthesis reaction to make this peptide bond. Now, you can look here and we'll see that we have this oxygen and hydrogen radical here and this hydrogen here. These 2 are what's going to come together to form the water, and when it does, this carbon and nitrogen is going to join together, and that's what forms our peptide bond. So remember, that's going to be a dehydration synthesis reaction, and that's how we form our proteins. Okay, so what's the importance of proteins? Well, simply it's this here. We're basically made up of them. That's what we are. We're just, like I said, a bunch of proteins that are all stuck together. Now, we cannot make some of the amino acids, so they have to be ingested. We have to eat them, and those are the essential amino acids that we talk about. And what will happen is those amino acids come in and they get strung together like this. As they get strung together like this, they start to fold, and then we end up with these convoluted and complex structures like we see down here. Okay, so those are the proteins. Good luck in the lessons, and as always, we'll see you in the next video. Okay, so let's start by talking about nucleic acids. As we mentioned in the goals, nucleic acids serve as the information storage molecules, and there are 2 of them that we want to be familiar with. The first and foremost that we all know about is DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA is our blueprints. It's how we make ourselves. They're the plans to make you. There's also another nucleic acid called RNA, and that's ribonucleic acid. And RNA is what is used to make proteins. And remember, you're made of proteins. So DNA is like the plans, RNA are like the working plans that we use. Now, our nucleic acids are again going to be a polymer. So it's a macromolecule. So you're going to see all these little components strung together. Remember, these are the monomers of a polymer. And in our case, it's this guy right here. It's a nucleotide. And our nucleotides are going to be a phosphate group and a sugar, and these are what's going to make up the backbone. I'll show you that in a second. And then we have our nitrogenous bases, and this is what actually stores the information and allows it to be passed on from generation to generation. So let's take a look at the structure of our nucleic acids in the next slide. Okay, so let's talk real quickly about building DNA, and we'll get into a little more detail a little bit later on in the course. But for now, I want you to notice that we have this sugar-phosphate backbone. And what that means is that the sugar and a phosphate from one nucleotide is the phosphate's going to bond to the sugar of the next one. So this is where we're joining it together. We'll join another one here and join another one here, and we'll do another one, and that makes us a long strand of DNA. Now what's really neat about the DNA is that that single strand doesn't like to be that way. It likes to be two strands. So that means that this nitrogenous base pair that we see here, which stores the information, is going to bond with another one here by hydrogen bonding, so it'll stick together, and we end up not with one strand, but two strands of the DNA there. And then in the cells, it'll actually coil around and form this double helix that we see over here. We'll learn more about the reason we know that and how all that works a little bit later on in the course. All right, so we mentioned that there are two kinds of nucleic acids that store information. We have DNA here and we have RNA here. Our DNA, like we showed you, is double-stranded, while our RNA here is going to be a single-stranded molecule. The bases in a DNA are going to be adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. And in an RNA, we see the adenine again, the cytosine, and the guanine, but there is a difference. It has have this uracil instead of the thymine. So that's one other difference between DNA and RNA. And then finally, the base sugar is different. In DNA, that D stands for deoxyribose, and in RNA, that R stands for ribosomal or RNA. Okay? So those are the differences between DNA and RNA, and we'll be learning more about those in the lessons. As always, good luck on the lessons, and we'll see you in the next video. Okay, so let's talk about enzymes today. What are they? First and foremost, they are a protein. So that's one of the types of proteins that we have are enzymes. The role of enzymes is they allow chemical reactions to happen easier in a sense. They use less energy this way, and they do this by lowering what they call the activation energy. The activation energy is the amount of energy necessary to drive a chemical reaction, and by using enzymes, we're able to lower the amount of energy needed for it to go. And then why is this important? Well, in us and in most organisms, we have a series of reactions that need to happen, and they don't happen at a pace quick enough at the temperatures our bodies can live at. So these enzymes then function as a way to catalyze or to make these reactions happen at a lower temperature. So we're able to live because of enzymes. Enzymes are a convoluted protein, okay, and you can kind of see that one down here. It kind of looks like an anglerfish. And they have this special area called the activation site. And then whatever the substrate is, that's this here, substrate's basically what an enzyme is going to act on, that substrate will fit into the activation site. And you may have more than one substrate, and what will happen is it'll bring these molecules closer together if it's joining them, or it can put it into a position and then bend itself so that it can start to separate those substrates apart. So enzymes, quite simply, their purpose is they lower the amount of energy and they make these reactions that we need to have happen in order for us to be alive happen. Okay, so that's it for enzymes. The lessons will go through this in a lot more detail. I just wanted to give you a brief overview. Good luck as always, and I'll see you in the next video.